All right, strap yourselves in because today we are diving deep into Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche.
Oh, yeah.
Not exactly a walk in the park, this one, but
It's a thinker.
it will challenge you. It'll make you think differently.
Absolutely.
So before we get into it, I need you to sort of set the stage for us.
Okay.
Who was Nietzsche and what on earth was he trying to do with this book?
Well, Nietzsche was this German philosopher writing in the late 1800s, and I think he was known for just taking a hammer to all conventional thought, like everything he thought was good and right, especially Judeo-Christian morality.
He really goes after it.
Oh, yeah.
So in this deep dive, we're not going to cover every single thing in this book.
Oh, no, it's dense.
But we are going to pull out those insights that will hopefully change the way that you see the world and maybe even yourself.
Yeah, we'll explore those big concepts like the will to power, master morality, the death of God, really foundational, challenging concepts that Nietzsche was writing about.
One of the things that struck me right away, and I think this is true of any philosophy, but Nietzsche really hits on this point, is he attacks this, what he calls the prejudices of philosophers. So he's saying that even the greatest thinkers are influenced by their own biases.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's so fascinating about Nietzsche is he isn't just critiquing those other philosophers.
Right.
He's questioning the whole nature of what it means to even do philosophy.
Yeah.
Like, are we ever objective?
Yeah.
He argues that our passions and prejudices are always influencing us.
So he's basically saying that there's no such thing as truth.
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? I
Yeah.
mean, he rejects these absolute unchanging truths that are just sort of handed down to us from some authority, right? He sees truth as something much more fluid and dynamic and something we create as we go.
If everything is up for grabs, then how do we decide what to believe in?
I love that.
It's like he's pulling the rug out from under us.
Yeah, and that's the genius of Nietzsche, right? He wants to shake us out of our complacency. He's challenging us to question everything and to be skeptical of anyone claiming to have all the answers.
Including ourselves.
Including ourselves, yeah, absolutely.
So instead of searching for the ultimate truth, we should be focusing on
What? Understanding the forces that shape our beliefs, you know? What are the hidden desires and fears that drive our thinking? Become more self-aware and more critical of our own assumptions in the world around us.
This is where his critique of traditional morality comes in, I think.
Yeah.
Especially like Judeo-Christian values. Slave morality, he calls it. Compassion, humility, selflessness.
Right.
Those are the things that, most of us were raised with.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting here is he's not saying those qualities are bad.
Right.
He's questioning the motivations behind them.
Okay.
Why are we selfless? Why are we humble? And he argues that slave morality arose as this resentment against the powerful.
Okay.
So it's a way for the weak to invert values,
Okay.
to call what is powerful evil.
So instead of celebrating strength and creativity and individuality, slave morality praises weakness and humility and conformity.
Exactly. It's like turning the world upside down.
Yeah.
Making weakness seem like a virtue.
And then he goes on to talk about pity, which is fascinating because he doesn't have very nice things to say about pity.
No. Nietzsche sees pity as this dangerous emotion that drains us of our vitality.
Interesting.
And look, he's not advocating for cruelty.
Right.
But he is challenging us to think about the potential downsides of pity.
So if we shouldn't be guided by pity or compassion, what should be driving us?
This is where we get to one of Nietzsche's most famous and controversial ideas, the will to power. This is the force that drives all life, this urge to grow, to overcome obstacles,
Yeah.
to assert yourself in the world.
It's not just wanting to dominate people, though.
No, it's much more than that.
It's much deeper.
Yeah, it's about self-realization.
Okay.
Striving to achieve your full potential.
Okay, so you've got slave morality versus the will to power, and then you've got this whole, death of God thing.
Oh yeah, one of the most famous and misunderstood phrases, right?
Yeah, what does that even mean?
Yeah, so he's not saying God literally died.
Okay.
This is a metaphor. It's for the decline of traditional morality, valors, religious values.
Okay.
This loss of faith in absolute truths, external authorities.
So he's writing this in a time when science is challenging religious dogma.
Yeah.
All these, Societal structures are breaking down.
Think about it. This is a time of upheaval.
Yeah.
And he saw that as both a crisis and an opportunity.
A crisis because we're losing these old anchors of meaning, but an opportunity because
Because it forces us to confront this question. What does it even mean to be human in a world without these given answers?
so if we're no longer bound by the old rules, if God is dead, what's next?
Yeah, does he give us a roadmap?
Yeah.
Not really a step-by-step, but he gives us this vision, this ideal of what humanity could become.
And that's the Übermensch.
The Übermensch.
Yeah, and it always gets mistranslated as like Superman.
Yeah.
Which is not what he's talking about.
Not some guy in a cape, no.
Yeah.
It's much more metaphorical than that.
So what did he have in mind?
It's a representation of what we could achieve if we embrace our will to power,
Okay.
overcome the limitations of traditional morality, and create our own values based on a deep understanding of ourselves and the world,
So it's about mental and spiritual strength, self-mastery.
pushing beyond perceived limitations,
Yeah.
and striving for this life of creativity, passion, self-realization.
Yeah.
It's really about becoming the authors of our own destinies.
I can see how all these pieces fit together.
Yeah.
Nietzsche's really challenging us to break free from these chains of conventional thinking, embrace this will to power, and create a new way of being in the world. But how do we actually do that?
That's where things get really interesting.
That is.
And that's what we'll be exploring as we continue our deep dive into Beyond Good and Evil.
I love it. I love it. We've been talking about how Nietzsche wasn't a big fan of just blindly following the crowd.
Yeah, definitely not.
He really saw like conformity and blind obedience as the enemies of individual growth.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating how that resonates even more strongly today, right? I mean, think about it. We're just bombarded constantly with messages telling us what to think, what to buy, who to be.
Yeah, it's like a constant barrage.
It is, and it takes a lot of effort, I think, to step back and question those narratives and forge your own path.
He had this one line that really struck me. He said, "Madness is rare in individuals, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule."
Oh, yeah.
It's like he could see how easily people get swept up in groupthink.
He was incredibly perceptive about the dangers of that mob mentality.
Yeah.
How quickly reason and individual conscience can be silenced when everyone's caught up in this collective fervor.
And this ties into his critique of democracy, right?
Yeah.
He wasn't a fan of rule by the masses.
Yeah, it's true. Nietzsche was very critical of democracy. He saw it as a system that often prioritizes mediocrity over excellence. He worried that it would lead to a leveling down,
Right.
a suppression of the exceptional individual for the sake of the average.
But he wasn't advocating for tyranny, was he?
No, not at all. I think he was more concerned with how do you strike a balance?
Right.
How do you create a society that allows for individual flourishing without, descending into chaos or suppressing those who don't fit the mold? It's a tension that's still with us today.
Right. And this is where the idea of the Übermensch comes in again.
Yeah.
That individual who rises above the herd, who creates their own values, who doesn't need that crutch of traditional morality.
Yeah, the Übermensch embodies this ideal of self-reliance, creating meaning in a world that no longer provides it ready-made, but it's a challenging concept.
Oh, for sure.
One that's been misinterpreted and misused throughout history.
It has.
Yeah.
Let's go back to this idea of slave morality for a minute. Nietzsche seems to suggest that it's all about resentment. What did he mean by that?
He argued that slave morality arises from a place of weakness, from this resentment of those who lack the power to create their own values and impose their will on the world. So they react by inverting the values of the powerful, labeling strength and assertiveness as evil and weakness and humility as good.
So it's like a psychological defense mechanism.
Yeah, a way of coping with feelings of powerlessness.
But doesn't that kind of ignore the very real suffering that people experience? Sometimes people are weak and vulnerable because they've been oppressed or exploited.
That's a great question, and one that gets to the heart of some of the controversies surrounding Nietzsche. He's not saying we should be indifferent to suffering.
Right.
But he's challenging us to think about the ways in which compassion can sometimes be misdirected or even counterproductive.
So what's the alternative?
Well, Nietzsche would say that true strength lies in empowering others to overcome their own challenges, not in simply feeling sorry for them.
So it's about helping people to become stronger, more independent,
More capable of creating their own destinies, exactly.
and that's not always easy.
No, sometimes it requires pushing people beyond their comfort zones, challenging their assumptions, even holding them accountable for their choices.
So we've got this tension between master and slave morality, the idea of the will to power, the death of God, the Übermensch.
It's a lot.
What did Nietzsche actually think we should do with all this?
Yeah, well, Nietzsche wasn't a political theorist in the traditional sense.
Right.
He wasn't laying out like a blueprint for utopia,
Yeah.
but he was deeply concerned with the question of how we should live, both as individuals and as a society.
What kind of world did he envision?
A world that valued creativity, individuality, and excellence.
Okay.
A world that embraced risk and experimentation, where people weren't afraid to challenge conventions.
But how do you create that kind of society without descending into chaos or tyranny?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Nietzsche doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does provide us with a set of tools for thinking about these questions,
Yeah.
for grappling with the complexities of human nature and the challenges of social organization.
It's like he's saying that personal transformation is the foundation for social transformation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Nietzsche was deeply suspicious of anyone who claimed to have all the answers, who offered simple solutions to complex problems. True wisdom comes from self-reflection,
Yeah.
from a willingness to question our own assumptions and confront the uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
And his writing style is so important because he's not just presenting like a systematic argument.
No, he's provoking us.
Yeah.
He wants to shake us out of our complacency.
And it brings us back to this idea of perspectivism.
Right. The idea that there's no single objective truth, that everything we believe is shaped by our own individual perspective.
So we need to be aware of the limitations of our own perspectives, to be open to other ways of seeing things.
That's a great insight. There's a tension there, a balance that Nietzsche is constantly trying to strike, you know? He's not advocating for an anything goes relativism.
Right.
He's not saying that all beliefs are equally valid.
Yeah.
But he is pushing us to recognize the subjective element in all knowledge, to be more self-aware about the ways in which our own biases and experiences shape our understanding of the world.
That's a really valuable lesson, especially in today's world where we're just bombarded with information.
From all sides.
We need to be able to step back and critically evaluate those perspectives.
That's the essence of critical thinking.
You mentioned earlier that Nietzsche's ideas have been misinterpreted and misused. Can you give us some examples of that?
That's a complex question, one that we could probably spend hours discussing.
Right.
But one of the most common misinterpretations is this idea that Nietzsche was advocating for like a ruthless individualism, a survival of the filth mentality where the strong dominate the weak.
And that's been used to justify a lot of terrible things, from colonialism and imperialism to fascism and eugenics.
But I think that's a very superficial reading of Nietzsche. He was certainly critical of what he saw as the weakness and decadence of modern society.
Yeah.
But he wasn't advocating for a return to some kind of primitive brutality. He was much more nuanced than that.
So how do we avoid those kinds of misinterpretations?
I think it's important to remember that Nietzsche was writing in a very specific historical context, a time of great upheaval and uncertainty. He was reacting against what he saw as the stifling conformity and moral hypocrisy of his era. And he was trying to articulate a vision of a more authentic, more life-affirming way of being in the world.
So it's not about simply embracing power for its own sake. It's about using power to create something beautiful, something meaningful, something that affirms life in all its complexity.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've talked about slave morality, the will to power, the death of God, the Übermensch. We've touched on his critique of democracy, his emphasis on self-knowledge. What other key insights do you think are important?
One of the things that really struck me is Nietzsche's profound understanding of human psychology.
Yeah, like he can see through our masks and those not so pretty motivations behind our actions.
He had an uncanny ability to peel back those layers of social convention
Yeah.
and reveal the raw, often uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
Like his ideas about how we use language It's not just about communication.
It's about power. Nietzsche recognized how language can be used to manipulate, to control, to shape the way people perceive reality.
He was very critical of how we use these abstract concepts and moral categories to obscure the truth.
We crave certainty.
Yeah.
We crave clear-cut distinctions between good and evil, right and wrong. But Nietzsche argues that the world is much messier, much more ambiguous.
So instead of trying to fit everything into neat little boxes,
Yeah.
we should embrace the complexity, the contradictions.
Exactly. Nietzsche encourages us to confront the full spectrum of human experience, to acknowledge the darkness as well as the light.
This is where his critique of resentment comes in. It's like he's saying that holding on to that anger and bitterness just poisons us.
It eats away at our vitality, our creativity, our very capacity for joy.
Yeah.
He believed that it stems from this sense of powerlessness, from the feeling that we're somehow being wronged.
And instead of overcoming those feelings, we just try to make ourselves into the victim.
And that just perpetuates the cycle of resentment.
So what's the antidote?
Nietzsche would say it's self-overcoming, confronting our weaknesses, our fears, our limitations.
That sounds a lot like the idea of the Übermensch.
It is. It's about tapping into our potential, embracing the challenge of becoming more than we are.
And that ties back into the will to power.
Exactly.
It's about mastering ourselves.
Channeling that creative energy towards growth and self-actualization.
But some people say that Nietzsche is too individualistic, that he ignores community and social responsibility.
I think that's a misreading of his work. While he certainly championed individual self-realization, he also recognized the importance of shared values.
Okay.
He wasn't advocating for a society of isolated individuals,
Right.
but a community of strong, independent thinkers.
It's about finding that balance,
Yeah, between individual freedom and the needs of the collective,
right?
between self-expression and a shared sense of purpose.
It's a delicate balance.
It requires maturity, self-awareness, and a willingness to engage in dialogue with those who hold different perspectives.
And he had some interesting things to say about art and culture. He seemed to believe that art could be a powerful force for both good and evil.
Nietzsche saw art as a reflection of the human spirit, a way of expressing our deepest values, our hopes, our fears.
But he was also wary of the ways in which art could be used to manipulate or control.
Right, he was critical of what he saw as the decadence and nihilism of a lot of modern art, which he felt reflected a loss of faith in traditional values.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of these big, challenging ideas,
We have.
but what does it all mean for us?
Yeah.
How can we apply his ideas to our own lives?
One of the most important takeaways is this emphasis on self-knowledge.
Yeah, that famous line, "He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow."
Exactly, and that why comes from within.
Yeah.
From a deep understanding of our own values, our motivations.
So he's calling for a kind of radical self-acceptance,
Yes, a willingness to embrace all aspects of ourselves.
even the parts we don't like.
Yes, and to integrate those aspects into a more holistic understanding of who we are.
And it ties back to self-overcoming,
It's a constant process of growth,
of pushing ourselves,
of striving to become more than we are.
and maybe creating something beautiful and meaningful in the process.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into beyond good and evil, what final thoughts would you leave our listeners with?
I would encourage them to engage with Nietzsche's ideas critically, to question them, to challenge them, and to see how they resonate with their own experiences. To embrace that challenge of self-knowledge.
And to never stop questioning.
Exactly, because as Nietzsche himself said, the most important thing is not to stop questioning.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought from Nietzsche to ponder. Become who you are. It's like he had this X-ray vision into the human heart, you know.
I think he could just see through all our facades, those masks that we wear, expose those not so pretty motivations, the things we don't want to admit to ourselves even.
And he does it so, so well.
Yeah.
One of the areas that I find most fascinating is how we use language, right? It's not just about communication.
No, absolutely not. Language is about power.
Oh, yeah.
Nietzsche recognized that.
Yeah.
He saw how language can be used to manipulate, to control, to shape the way that we view reality.
He was especially critical of how these abstract concepts and moral categories can be used to obscure the truth, rather than illuminate it.
Yeah, we think we're clarifying things, but
Yeah.
often we're just muddying the waters.
Right. So instead of trying to fit everything into these nice, neat little boxes, we should maybe embrace the complexity,
The contradictions.
embrace the messiness of it all.
Yeah, Nietzsche really encourages us to confront that full spectrum of human experience, the darkness as well as the light.
Absolutely. It's all part of the picture, right?
It is, and this is where I think his critique of resentment comes in. This is where he's saying that holding on to anger and bitterness, it just poisons us.
Doesn't actually solve anything.
It doesn't solve anything, just makes us feel bad. He saw it as this corrosive force.
Yeah.
It eats away at our vitality, our creativity, our joy.
And it stems from this sense of powerlessness.
This feeling that we're being wronged somehow.
Right.
That we're being denied something we deserve.
And instead of overcoming it, we try and justify it. We try and make ourselves into the victim.
Right. And that just perpetuates the whole cycle.
So what's the antidote? If we shouldn't be focusing on resentment and wallowing in self-pity,
He would say it's self-overcoming.
self-overcoming.
Confronting our weaknesses, our fears, our limitations.
That's the Übermensch, right? That's what that is.
It is. It's about becoming the best versions of ourselves.
Striving for that self-realization.
Embracing that challenge to become more than we are.
That ties back into the will to power.
Exactly.
It's not about dominating others. It's about mastering ourselves.
Channeling that creative energy towards growth, towards self-actualization.
I've heard some people say that Nietzsche is too individualistic. That he doesn't care about community or social responsibility. I don't think that's true.
I don't think so either.
I think that's a misreading of his work.
While he championed individual self-realization, he also understood the importance of shared values.
Right.
The importance of a sense of belonging.
It's about finding that balance between freedom and responsibility, self-expression, and a shared sense of purpose.
A delicate balance, you know?
Right.
It requires maturity, self-awareness,
Yeah.
a willingness to engage with those who think differently than us.
What about art and culture? He had some very interesting things to say about those.
He did. Nietzsche saw art as this reflection of the human spirit, a way of expressing our deepest values, our hopes, our fears,
Yeah.
our dreams. He believed that great art could inspire us, it could challenge us, it could even transform us.
But he was also wary of how art could be used to manipulate,
to control.
to promote ideologies that might be harmful.
He was very critical of what he saw as the decadence and nihilism of much of modern art, right?
Yeah.
Which he saw as this reflection of a loss of faith in traditional values.
Right. So we've talked about a lot of these big challenging ideas, but what does it all mean for us? Like, how do we take these ideas and use them to live better, more fulfilling lives?
One of the most important takeaways, I think, is this emphasis on self-knowledge.
Yeah, he had that famous line, "He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow."
Exactly, and that why, it comes from within, from a deep understanding of our values, our motivations, our aspirations.
So he's calling us to become the authors of our own lives.
Yes, define our own purpose.
Live in accordance with it.
It's a radical self-acceptance, a willingness to embrace all aspects of ourselves.
Even the parts we might not like.
Yes, it's about recognizing them, understanding them, and finding a way to channel them into something positive.
That's the self-overcoming.
Right, it's about growth.
Embracing those challenges,
Right.
becoming more resilient, and maybe even creating something beautiful in the process.
Exactly.
So, any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
I would just encourage everyone to engage with Nietzsche's ideas critically, question them, challenge them, and see how they resonate with your own experiences.
Yeah, embrace the challenge of self-knowledge.
And never stop questioning.
Never stop questioning. That's good. That's good.
Because as Nietzsche himself said, the most important thing is not to stop questioning.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought from Nietzsche to ponder. Become who you are.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure exploring beyond good and evil with you.